Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Outdoor Art Club presentation of Fighting for Housing in America. I'm Robin Geisler, and I'm working with Kathleen Taylor to bring you today's program. For those of you who are not familiar with the Outdoor Art Club, we're a nonprofit women's organization founded in 1902. The club engages in civic, cultural, and charitable work in our community. To give you an idea of a few of our past contributions, several years after, let me start again on that. To give you an idea of a few of our past contributions, the club ran a well baby clinic in our community for many years after its founding. Last year, the club granted funds to the neighborhood resource groups in Cascade Canyon and Scottsdale to purchase 30 neighborhood block captain kits. And every year, the Outdoor Art Club runs a public speaker series so that people like you have the opportunity to learn about topics as varied as the innovative employment programs offered to formerly incarcerated men at San Quentin to help them to find employment, and the history of the Bay Area's effort to build adequate, affordable housing. And before I turn this program over to today's program chair, please note that Zoom has two different functions, one for chat and another for Q&A. We will not be using chat today, but we will use Q&A for you to send questions to Connor anytime during the program. He will save time to answer them and welcomes them at the end of his presentation. Well, it's actually a conversation, at the end of his conversation. At this time, I'd like to introduce Kate McCormick. Kate is a member of the Outdoor Art Club and program chair for today's event. Thank you, Kate, for bringing us today's very timely program, Fighting for Housing in America.
Thank you, Robin. Greetings to all of you. It's my pleasure to introduce Connor Doherty, the author of Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America. Connor is an economics and housing reporter at the New York Times, based in San Francisco. He grew up in the Bay Area and lives here again after 10 years in New York City. On his route to journalism, he majored in chemistry at UC San Diego, taught math, then made the switch to journalism at the Los Angeles Business Journal, the San Diego Union Tribune, and the Wall Street Journal before joining the New York Times in 2014. Welcome to the Outdoor Art Club, Connor.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I think we booked this a year ago. That's got to be a record. But...
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Thank you for remembering. Connor's book was published a few weeks before the pandemic shutdown last March, and the paperback version of Golden Gates was released this February. His book was a recipient of many awards, including it was a Time 100 must-read book of 2020. Fortune selected it as one of the 10 best business books of 2020, and it was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Housing availability, affordability, and homelessness poll as major concerns for all Californians. Golden Gates provides a valuable look back over many decades to cover the social and economic pressures that continue to make affordable housing such a challenge. In his book, Connor approached his subject by focusing on 5 very different people in the Bay Area who became activists for affordable housing. Connor, house and home mean the same place to many of us. Everyday phrases come to mind like home is where the heart is, there's no place like home. Researching affordable housing must have seemed like you were taking on a spectrum of emotional, economic, and moral issues. And the more I prepared for this event, the more I agreed with the question you posed in the new preface to your paperback. You wrote, Golden Gates began with a question: why is America's housing problem seemingly impossible to solve? So my question for you to start with is, why did you take on this unsolvable subject, and what did you hope to achieve?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thanks for that really nice introduction. And thanks everyone who's here for watching, even though I can't see you the way I wish I could if I was on a chair and in a stage or whatever your normal setup is. But anyway, it's still nice to be here. I probably didn't know what I was getting into when I first started this subject. I'll just give you some background about how I came to the story. I'm an economics reporter and have been for many years. And I had gotten very interested in housing and this housing affordability problem, which has been kind of growing for some time. But this sort of issue of not having enough housing and it being difficult to meet the demand of housing with the supply was something that was really kind of academic. Many of the people I talked to about this problem were economists or policy wonks. It didn't really feel like the average person was thinking about it, at least in those terms. Certainly you could find people who were annoyed about housing costs or something like that, but they didn't really kind of tie it to these broader issues. Then one day I was talking to a guy named Jeremy Stoppelman, who's the founder and CEO of Yelp. And he told me he had started funding this woman, Sonia, who ran this group called BARF, which stood for the Bay Area Renters Federation. She was obviously out to get attention and out to make an impression, which she did. The first time we met, she showed up in a orange police car, a Crown Victoria, but it was covered in glitter. And I followed her around and sort of noticed that there was this group of younger millennials who were younger as in under 40, who were very concerned and were tying this housing supply issue to their wants in life. But the more I guess I got deeper into it, the more I kind of came to understand what you just said, is that this is this massive problem and it has so many facets. Like a lot of people who've written about housing, I read The Power Broker, this sort of famous book by Robert Caro, as I was doing this. And he says in the book, while there's one or where there might be 2 or 3 sides to a dispute over a park, but there are 40 over housing. And I thought that was really true and remains true today. So I guess the reason I the reason I continued with it after realizing how daunting it was is that to some extent, this is the problem of kind of modern civilization. How are we gonna set up how and where we live, and how are we going to accommodate children and growth and changing industries? Like, if you think about humanity as sort of just people collected into civilization with art and commerce and family life and all these other things, sort of how they choose to organize that and where and how they choose to live pretty much defines that. So it's both a subject that isn't going to have a resolution, as well as a subject that is always important and always tells us something about us and who we are. So I feel like inside these stories are kind of the really basic things people are going for in life, which is to have security and hopefulness for their future.
Thank you. It sounds like something we will continue to struggle with. In one of your articles on housing early this year, you referred to the blizzard of bills introduced in Sacramento related to housing. Not surprisingly, many communities see these bills as a threat to the character of their suburban towns or city neighborhoods, and not to mention the prospect of unknown costs that come with dense development. Have you observed policies in the middle ground between state mandates and local zoning that give you hope for making progress towards more housing?
I guess it's hard to define what the middle ground is, because, for instance, there was a bill a couple of years ago that got a lot of attention, SB 50. And one of the compromises, the bill ultimately died, but one of the compromises along the way was that more suburban places would have um, to accept triplexes and fourplexes, but not super high density developments. Some people would describe that as a middle ground. Some people would describe that as a bulldozer bill. Hard to know where the middle ground, there was a development I wrote about in the book. This is this long saga in the book where somebody proposes a 315 unit apartment development that was totally within the zoning that the city had set out for itself. The city, many of the residents and city council members objected to this, and they came up with a compromise, what seemed like a compromise, to reduce the density of that development by a factor of 10 to about 40 some homes, so a little less, and many of the neighbors said that wasn't good enough, that they wanted there to be no more than 4 on 20 acres next to a BART stop and the freeway. So I don't know where's the middle ground there, right? So it's hard to, but I will say philosophically, my feeling is this. We live in a giant interconnected region that has a lot of resources that everyone is paying for and that makes it the region it is. We have a Golden Gate Bridge, we have a Richmond San Rafael Bridge, we have a Bay Bridge, we have freeways, we have water treatment plants, we have recreation, massive recreation areas that are purchased by the state and federal government. And all of those are resources that would not exist without a much larger region securing it. And I think that that means that we have to sort of figure out how to operate. We have to solve some of our problems on that same scale. As I've sort of spoken about in the past, there are a number of suburbs, or what call themselves suburbs, in the Silicon Valley that have buildings such as Cupertino that are basically a skyscraper. They aren't that tall, right? But they accommodate the number of employees that's in a skyscraper. And when you start having that kind of intensity of use, I think that you start having to accept responsibility. So I don't know where a state mandate comes in. It seems to me, though, that we should have some rules that if you choose one sort of growth, you have to accommodate another sort of growth. Again, it feels to me like it's interesting. You look at a place like I said, the Silicon Valley, people always refer to it as anti-growth, but it's not really anti-growth because doesn't appear to be an office building they didn't love. There's just a lot of housing they didn't love, so anyway, I do think when we talk about, so I guess my answer is that there should be some sort of regional consideration here. I do think ultimately that cities can make better decisions about where and how to build things. But so for instance, in this example in Lafayette, I could totally imagine, where they proposed this development to, 300 unit development. I could imagine the city saying, I'm just making this up, right? But I'm just saying, I could imagine them saying, we accept that we need to add that many more units, or we just don't think that's the right place. There might be another place, or, I could see something like that, you know, being reasonable. I could also see it being unreasonable. But my point is, I think that kind of agency makes sense. But I do think that when people start saying, you know, I want to live on a farm in the middle of a gigantic city, that gets a little unreasonable.
That that makes sense, and it's very difficult when there are such different views about how we define what our community is. And you mentioned open land, which we have plenty of in this county. You had written about the Sierra Club and its movement to preserve open land. And you wrote about it as it affected housing decisions beginning back in the 60s. How do you suggest environmentalism can be balanced in relation to affordable housing or greater density?
So environmentalism is a very large question. And as you sort of referred to, when environmentalism sort of first became a mass movement, it really wasn't what we consider environmentalism today. If you look at the early Sierra Club, which is obviously this very, very old organization founded in San Francisco, or I don't know if it was founded in San Francisco, but John Muir was a member, you know, anyway. And it was really kind of concerned with what you might call conservation. It was worried about how do we keep open, how do we protect truly wild nature? You know, how do we not build dams? How do we not, you know, how do we not destroy natural waterways? You know, a lot of conflicts with, you know, extractive industries and factory farming and things like that. And it was only when the suburbs kind of became the predominant form of living in America that things like, you know, a dog park or a park or open space, or really just the margins of a city, started to be sort of treated as the environment. Now, it's not to say open space and all that, it was never a concern. Obviously, going back to Olmsted or whatever else, people have had tremendous thoughts about green space in cities. But it's just to say that I don't think it was tied up with fracking and things like that the way it is now. So I guess when we start asking the question, how do we want to make a better environment and have less impact on our planet, I think we have to ask that question in a sort of realistic way. If we are driving everywhere and using our car for middling errands and sort of not creating any option for people other than to drive to work alone, is the fact that their house might have a lovely lawn and looks, you know, relatively low density, is that good for the environment? It doesn't strike me as good for the environment. And so I guess my answer is sort of almost a question, which is, what do we mean when we say the environment? You know, sometimes I think, I'm saying this a little hyperbolically, but when we think of what a city is, it's almost like this negotiation with nature, where we sort of say, okay, nature, we're going to go mess up that little circle of land as much as humanly possible. But we're going to try and keep that circle as tight as we can. And therefore, you know, aside from a few backpacking trips, we'll kind of like leave you alone, right? And I think that when we start treating every lawn in front of our house as, you know, as sacred as, you know, a redwood forest, we create the conditions that lead to sprawl, which kind of breaks that little circle contract, if you will. Anyway, so my answer is I'm not saying everything in the world has to be skyscrapers. And I think that's a huge misconception of density generally. You know, I've seen people, you know, it's funny, I saw a big urban advocate recently referred to skyscrapers as, quote, vertical sprawl. And I actually think that's very well said. You know, like skyscraper neighborhoods are not pleasant, but neighborhoods with a lot of 3, 4, 5-story things with a mix of uses, with triplexes and duplexes, it all seems, some of the most beautiful cities in the world, San Francisco, Paris, whatever, have that type of mix, and they're not lacking for parks. They're not lacking for clean air or lovely lives.
Um, that those are all good points. I mean, I don't know about having a lawn and, you know, how, what we do with those lawns now, but it gets me to another thing that I read about that you wrote about, which was a new housing development being built near Phoenix. And it will house 1,000 residents and be completely car-free. That developer clearly has a vision and the luxury of starting from scratch. Whereas most communities are a work in progress and they're building on the decisions that have been made over decades and decades. And, you know, they were started as little towns somewhere and then became much closer. So they had their lawns and their larger lots and so on. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I don't expect you to answer that particularly, but in your research, have you found any communities where a common vision has resulted in more affordable housing to the satisfaction of most of the community? Because it seems so much like it's NIMBY versus YIMBY kind of thing.
I guess this is, so I should note that my primary interest is large metropolitan areas, right? And when I say metro areas, I mean the whole metro area, right? And the reason that's my primary reference is, as I said, I am an economics reporter. Something like 3/4 of the entire economy of the United States is in like 100 metro areas. I think it's like 2/3 of the population. So when we talk about these sort of large metro areas and certainly globally, that is kind of what, and it's something to say rural doesn't matter, but I don't feel like building high density housing in rural America is like such a great idea. You know what I'm saying? Like, so anyway, every community's sort of self-determination is inevitably a big fight. And that's what politics is. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that. I guess what the concern I have is that when you have sort of what Madison warned of, the sort of tyranny of the majority. The Bay Area is not really, the Bay Area is economically one region. There are all sorts of people in Marin County who would not live in Marin County if they couldn't be close to work. You know, if you want to live in a truly rural place, you can do that at very little cost and have a lovely, wonderful place, right? So when we talk about rural versus urban, I think that's kind of a false, it's funny, when I was doing the thing in Lafayette, they kept saying we're semi-rural, and I was like, semi-rural next to like a massive commuter rail line and like one of the most urbanized places in the world, like, you know, like it just, it's a little unfair to describe it that way. Anyway, so it's always going to be a fight. I guess what I was sort of starting to say is that when you have like a region that is economically one region, but you have 130 cities that all think their little relatively small piece of it is should have complete autonomy, except for those large things like freeways and water treatment plants and other things that they can't pay for, that starts to feel a little unfair. And so I think that if we had you know, I know people there is some unit of government, I don't know what it is, that can allow us to act more consonant with what our economic reality is. I don't, and I don't know exactly what that is. You know, I certainly don't think it would be a good idea if the federal government was drawing up zoning policy. It's probably not even a good idea if the state does it. But there is a way to do this that doesn't kind of allow pockets of 25,000 people to dictate the kind of fortunes of a region of 10 million. So I found a place that's okay with it. I mean, you could, I hate giving this answer because it's going to make everyone puke, but I think that places like Phoenix and Houston, if you look at, and I always say this to people, whether we like it or not, the future of America is being written in places like Phoenix and Atlanta and Houston and Dallas. That's where people are moving. People are leaving California to go to places like that. People are leaving Detroit and the kind of Rust Belts to go to places like that. Like, and why are people doing that? They're doing it, I guess, because they think the cost of living is lower. They have a better life there. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's fine. It relieves pressure. There's nothing on the whole wrong with that. I just think that we should also be trying to sort of allow people in our own region to have a better life. You know, so as I sort of said at the top, this is the sort of enduring problem. You know, there's been, one of the things I did for this book was read a lot of books, and there's probably, I don't know how many, but there are at least dozens of books purely about New York City housing. And they go back to, you know, Jacob Riis, who wrote How the Other Half Lives, you know, more than a century ago, right? So this subject is always fraught enough that there's always a huge fight over it. But I think there have been moments where it's gotten a little bit better. And if nothing else, just trying to sort of maintain it and maintain our progress is a fight enough.
And I think that certainly is happening. It's such a more visible subject. And I know in Marin and in Mill Valley, they have been working for years on affordable housing with accessory dwelling units and home share and looking at zoning issues. So I know that it is top of mind for every unit of government locally, although I don't think anybody appreciates hearing from the regional level particularly. But, you know, one of the things
so let me just ask you, do you want me to answer a couple questions? The reason I just kind of stopped you is there are several questions that basically revolve around what we were just talking about. But I defer to you if you want to keep going and do it.
well, let me just ask you one question.
No problem.
And then I think it's a good idea to go to those, and because we want to make sure we get them. When your hardback was published, the subtitle last year.
You advertised this question, but ask it and I have a very simple answer.
I did let Connor know I wanted to ask this. The subtitle was Fighting for Housing in America. This year in the paperback, it's been changed to the Housing Crisis and a Reckoning for the American Dream. So I wanted to ask why it was changed. And it occurred to me that ran into another question, which is many people have said, well, have things changed in the last year? And I don't know if that had anything to do with that, but if you could address that.
No, it was pretty much like a marketing decision. You know, the subtitles of books are changed, I won't say frequently, but it definitely happens that they're changed between hardback and paperback. It's common. And the publisher just decided this seemed like a better way to go. I will say that at various points, I've had discussions with my publisher about how we sort of communicate that while this is a book that is largely rooted in the Bay Area, it's meant to be emblematic of the same fights that happen in cities and suburbs across the nation. And there are points in the book, obviously, where we go and visit other cities and, more importantly, other activists from other cities. It sort of ends in Boston. But but I kind of, as I sort of say in the new preface, housing fights are adjudicated locally, and even if they sort of all sum up to a national housing problem, the only real way to sort of understand them is to look at them where they are, and the level at which they operate. So anyway, my point is, there has always been this kind of back and forth over whether or not we wanted to sort of lean into the California Bay Area stuff, or sort of try to make it seem more national. And I mean, I had very little input on I want to say I have no input, but I mean, there's probably 3 covers I got to see, and there were probably 100 that other people got to see. And, so there's a lot of, one of the things that's been really interesting to me about writing a book is you sort of then have this consumer product that goes on a shelf and is sold, whereas most of my life is just writing articles that are just kind of published, and I don't, aside from social media and stuff, I don't like think super deeply about how it's framed or marketed, maybe the headline, right? So there's like a lot that goes into a book and how you want to get someone to buy it off a shelf. And I suspect the title change had more to do with that. Maybe that answer was too honest, but I think that's the answer.
Thank you. Well, insights into publishing, that's okay.
Yeah. I've only done it once, so my insights are limited, but
well, you'll go on to have many more, I'm sure. I would like to address some questions, and how about if I read some of those?
Yeah.
Okay.
There are several I'm just glancing through that are kind of the same questions. So
okay, I'll start at the top, and we can take a look. I have heard that Marin County has been mandated by the state to build 14,000 new housing units. I don't know if this is true. And if true, I don't know the time frame. I've also heard the county permitting cannot consider water resources when reviewing these building permits. And please comment on how Marin County can do its part to address housing shortages within the context of Marin's very real water crisis.
So I don't want to get too deep into there are lots of different ways we could do more conservation. I think the state does need to think more seriously about water. They said that we wouldn't have water when 20 million people lived here. Now we have 40 million people. There are places like Israel that have even more intensity and have figured it out. It seems to me that we can figure out our water problems if we invest in them, just like we can figure out, our wildfire problems if we invest in them, but it's going to require, so that's kind of another example. I would guess that a lot of people in Marin County are very concerned about wildfire risk, but there's not any way they're going to be able to raise enough money on their own to bury a bunch of PG&E lines and do forest management at the scale we need. So if you start asking the state at that level to start protecting places, what obligation do you have to your community? So anyway, the answer to this question is, I do not know about 14,000, but there is a process. This is the same. There's a couple other questions that are similar. There is a process at the state called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And it's basically a process, it's a very complicated process where they basically say, here's how much housing you should build. Now, this has been true for many decades, but it's never been enforceable in any real way. It's just sort of like a guideline. Over the past few years, the state, through legislation, has sort of tried to find ways to put teeth in those guidelines, where you start to lose basically zoning power. I don't know about zoning power, but you start to lose land use control the further you fall behind, right? It seems to me that that is an attempt to capture that regional kind of consideration that I talked about, where they sort of say, okay, if you're keeping up with these goals, which are based on economic metrics and population and real things, if you're keeping up with these, then you can kind of do whatever you want, right? You don't got to worry about anything. But if you're falling behind, you're going to start to lose some amount of say over what happens with land use. So we could spend, and people do spend, a whole lot of time talking about the exact figures. But I think the philosophy behind it is sort of, we have these broad goals, and you should have to, there should be some policing of them, right? So that's kind of that. Somebody else, do you want to read the questions, or do you want me to sort of?
Sure. I think
So
you're.
that's the one that says here. Oh, and then somebody else asked about the same thing. They said, what income levels would work? So this is a question that comes up a lot, which is that right now, and there's a similar question at the bottom, which is blah, 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 blah. What about growing concentration of wealth, right? So I'll just start with sort of like a large sort of reality. The way cities work in the modern economy is, we have, over the past 40 years, bifurcated into these sort of knowledge industries, as they're called, which are, software, finance, things like that. And those are generally higher paying jobs. And then we have a much larger number, but much lower paid jobs of service sector jobs, which are, dog walking or yoga or whatever. It is, if you think about those service sector jobs, they are kind of the things that haven't been automated yet. They are things that do require a personal touch, and they require someone to be there. And there appears to be no shortage of demand for people to clean homes and do elder care and other things in a place like Marin County, but there's no place for those jobs to live. And this is kind of the structure of cities, because these service jobs have to be next to the kind of knowledge jobs, because they're basically waiting on people who have more money. And so when you look at, so they have to coexist in the same housing market, right? And I think that it is definitely true that developers do not build for that lower end of the market. But I think what's also true is that if they could make money doing so, they absolutely would. There's no shortage of people trying to make money off of lower income people through, dollar store or whatever else. It's just housing isn't one of them, because they can't get there. And I think that, some of that is going to require direct subsidy. And I'm a huge, I talk about that extensively in the book. But, we've gotten to the point now where affordable housing costs close to $1 million a unit in the Bay Area, or in San Francisco, and about $500,000-$600,000 statewide. How do you, if it costs $1 million to build something that's subsidized I don't know. I mean, that math doesn't work, right? So I think that simply making it easier to build housing at all levels is part of the solution. I also think we should have, affordable housing, which is a euphemism for subsidized housing. But, at some level, we have to, if we care about that segment of the market, we should also make that segment of the market easier to serve. And I've spent a lot of time with tenants. I spent a lot of time with people who are struggling with rent. And while some of them obviously would love, or all of them, I guess, would love an affordable apartment, when I talk to people about what they really want, they want to be able to go to Craigslist and find something for them, not to go to a government office and wait on a list for 10 years and then have someone check their income every couple years. And then be in a huge quandary if they want to move somewhere else for a better job or a different, whatever. So anyway, so I do think that finding ways to make that market easier to serve through these regional housing needs or other things is generally something we should be doing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I know, I wanted to say that when you talk about the tenants, that was an important part of your book for me, to hear the perspective of people whose housing was in jeopardy, or who were, for whom that was a major issue. And that is just one of the important messages in the book that gets lost sometimes in all of the other issues that we have. Let's see. So I can tell you're looking at the questions.
I am. Do you want me not to?
No, I think because you're able to see the ones that are.
I can sort of cut through them pretty quick,
Yeah.
I guess. Anyway, they all kind of revolve around a sort of general theme, which is one size fits all versus community. But I guess I would, you and I talked about this a little bit when we were meeting each other before this call. I don't know, there's a very fine line between so on the one hand, all these questions sort of say the state is domineering and this is totalitarian. I mean, they don't really say this, but you know what I mean? It's like a sort of, this is coming down on us, this is tyranny. But let's just we could also frame this a different way, which is, at what point do we start thinking about the individual? At what point can someone do with their own property what they want? I must confess, sometimes when I read these things about what your roof should look like and whatever, it just feels really, kind of gross that we want to kind of dictate everything about what the structures around us look like and exactly who's living in them. In Boulder, Colorado, they have a rule that says that, no more than, this many unrelated people can live in a home together. I assume it's to keep college kids from, this is probably common in college towns. But I mean, if you're a family with 12 people, you get that. I don't know, that there's something about that feels unfair and intrusive and not really anyone's business. And so, there is I'm not saying, the individual should have complete freedom, right? But there are people in Marin County who build substantial quarters inside their homes or behind their homes for relatives, for domestic help, and for au pairs. And we don't, but if you wanted to build a duplex, this is somehow seen as different, right? So I guess I just kind of feel like, while we're talking about the overbearing state, we should also temper that with a kind of respect for individuals as well. Again, I know it's a balance. I'm not saying, and I'm not saying somebody has the right to build a building as tall as they want in the middle of a forest or whatever because they owned a little plot of it. But
Well, it's difficult, and it certainly is a matter of interpretation. And one of the questions says, um, the writer says, in my opinion, a lot of those bills coming from the state could put in Mill Valley, our health and safety at risk because it's based on one size fits all. And I think that is kind of that problem of, that you referred to. If we don't do something, then then the requirements change. We're
yeah, again, this is all questions of balance as we're talking about, right? I mean, I don't have the perfect answer, except for that I know that if we had more plentiful housing, we would have less of a housing crisis. So, I was talking to someone during the course of the book who said, it was in Lafayette, and they said, sort of, don't you think we should have say over what happens in our neighborhood? And I sort of said, sure. But okay, so you ride BART to work every day. You're making, you're essentially dictating a decision to somebody else's neighborhood to put your employment there, right? You are using this massive state and federal resource, and local resource that cannot be funded anyway other than region wide. And it sort of feels like there's this, and the BART stop in the middle of that you take for granted and need to go to the airport. This is a salesperson. It's useless unless it gets to the airport, unless it gets to downtown, right? So should those people have some say over what's happening in your neighborhood, since you clearly have some say in what's happening in theirs? I don't know. I mean, it feels like that's a question people don't stop to ask, but it feels like a very relevant question, right? So I don't have, obviously I come down on the side of, we should grow in a way that's balanced, but balanced means truly balanced. If you build a bunch of office buildings somewhere, you're going to have to build some houses for them somewhere. Anyway, so, but somebody also asked, because I do kind of just want to answer this one. I don't know, pro-state legislation. Someone says, do people expect your decision to be pro-density, pro-state legislation, pro-development? So this is something I guess I struggle with a little, but it's kind of like the climate change debate, which is, at what point do you sort of feel like you're giving false balance to something? Meaning if you take every position, you sort of end up in a place where, I mean, we once wrote a story about evolution, and we got somebody who was like, this is so unfair because you didn't mention intelligent design. And it was like, do we have to, where do we come down on that, right? So I think it's pretty well established through pretty deep research and a fair amount of common sense that part of the problem, a significant part of the problem in the Bay Area's housing crisis, is that there's not enough housing, and that it has been bid up to its very high levels because of its scarcity. I think that when you look at some of the most expensive places, like say Palo Alto, which has about 4 jobs per every housing unit. Manhattan, the sort of island of skyscrapers, has about 2.5. That has something to do with the problem. So I don't know that I've tried in the book, my toddler's coming, as I warned you. I don't know that I tried to find a lot of different people who represented different perspectives on this problem. A tenant who's very, interested in tenant protections, an activist who's very interested in reforming zoning laws, a nun who starts a community land trust, a developer who is trying to build housing more efficiently. I think they're all trying to solve this problem in their own way. But anyway, it feels like, it doesn't feel like a sin, a journalistic sin, to say that it seems pretty clear that there's a housing shortage here. It seems pretty clear that the number of experts and the number of again, studies and consequences makes that pretty clear. Exactly how you solve it, if the Bay Area wanted to go build a new city somewhere else completely, which they're basically trying to do in LA right now with Tejon Ranch, that might be an idea to visit. I'm not completely against that. I'm just saying that it does feel like there is fundamentally a lack of homes and difficulty building them, and sort of saying that that's a central piece of the problem does not feel out of bounds.
Thank you for answering that as a journalist. One question also asks about homelessness. If housing can be secured, and it certainly seems to be a problem that gets worse in spite of all the effort to address it.
So the median home value in California just went to $700,000. As long as that number keeps going up, no amount of billions thrown into the homeless problem is going to do anything. Now, I'm writing a story right now, a somewhat optimistic story about homelessness, sort of talking about some of the state's effort to buy hotels, which is a temporary solution in a short-term moment when hotels are available for purchase. Seems like a very good way to to take a bigger bite than normal out of the problem. So I don't want to say that there aren't new tools and things we should be looking at and everything, but ultimately the state has to sort of at some point, a number like that $700,000, it's just like, unless you have wages to match, I just don't see how you get there. So I do think that I do hope that homelessness has started to wake people up and make people realize that there are real consequences to this housing crisis. And when I say consequences, I mean the sort of the real state of our streets, and the fact that this is our community and we have to look around it and say we are responsible for this. And then on top of that, if I've been spending a lot of time in LA because my mother-in-law lives down there, and it's really quite bad. And when you drive around LA, it's just not pleasant. People, it changes how people live. I've seen a number of people, like if your home is near a homeless encampment, it does start to affect the sale and everything. So I guess, and it's going to keep spiraling out of control. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it other than try to figure out how to make a space for this. So I think homelessness though, is not the entirety of our problem, because there are, I think that sometimes we lose the kind of really hardworking middle class and really hardworking working poor, as I sort of featured in my book. But I do think homelessness serves as the sort of most dire vision of what we're creating with this housing crisis. And when you go to other places that have plentiful housing, they simply don't have homelessness. I mean, California is really kind of unique in the world for this problem. I mean, you have to go, it's really, we've created a monster that just doesn't quite exist anywhere else, at least in this form, and certainly not in a place this wealthy. So I think that's a huge failure, and we should all take a lot of, should all feel very, very bad about it.
And I think really everybody does, because it's our world. So I think we have time for one more question. And I noticed one that, as studying economy, that you might have thoughts about. What are the pros and cons of rent control?
I hate answering this question. One of my favorite economists, I wrote somewhat sympathetically to rent control in the book, and one of the economists said, I feel like you've failed me. And, this is a guy I've talked to for years, right? Here's my think about rent control. I think that if you have a light form of rent control that is applied extremely widely, like statewide, like they did with the last rent control, I think that is absolutely something that we should talk about having. There's a couple of reasons why I think that. One reason is, think about what we do with homeowners. We have 30-year fixed mortgage, which is basically a federal entitlement. It is that's not a financial product you can get anywhere else in the world. It's been created by Fannie and Freddie. I don't care if you think that Wells Fargo was giving it to you out of the goodness of their heart. That is, a sort of security of fixed payment that is brought to you by the U.S. government via a massive intervention in credit markets through Fannie and Freddie. Then, of course, this has now gone away, but then there was the mortgage interest deduction, which, you can do up to, I guess, up to $750,000 now, which is most people, right? Maybe not in Marin, but, and there are a lot of benefits, to being a homeowner. And we have done all these things. We have created all these interventions, like the 30-year fixed mortgage, specifically to create more stable communities. I mean, people recognize, like, if someone buys a home for a tremendous amount of debt, and their debt payment starts moving around wildly with interest rates, they're probably not going to be in that home very long. So, so to expand home ownership and create a more stable kind of housing environment, our government, in its infinite wisdom, created this product to give people predictable payments. If it's good enough for homeowners, if it's good enough for people who are building wealth, through basically, the help of these programs, it seems to me it should be good enough for renters. Now, when you get into the super deep economic questions, it seems to me that the smarter way to do something like rent control would be a renter's tax credit, right? So something where you would, it's possible you could use like a refundable tax credit that would essentially guarantee someone's income. It basically would guarantee someone wouldn't have to spend more than, whatever it is, a third of their income, on rent. And you could, right, there are all sorts of program design things we could talk about that might be smarter than rent control, but would achieve the same ends. And if that were the policy conversation, I think that that would be a great, that'd be great. Um, right now, that's not the policy conversation. And when you go spend some time like with a girl like Stephanie, who, is in my book, and she's a 15-year-old girl who basically came home one day and found an $800 rent increase taped to her mother's door, or her family's door. And spent the next 6 months enduring, tremendous mental stress, fell behind on all her schoolwork and had to have panic attacks because she was truly worried about her family being homeless. I think when you start to really spend time with people like that and start to think about the cost of kids, the cost of education, the cost of, there's all these research papers that show that investment in early childhood education is like one of the most optimal investments any society can make. If you're destroying this child's education by allowing them to get, willy-nilly evicted, that feels like it would sort of undo that, right? So my point is that I think there's a policy conversation to be had about what's the smartest way to stabilize people, tenants. But I think fundamentally, finding a way to guarantee that someone's housing cost doesn't just like radically shoot out of their reach, week to week, month to month, it feels like a good societal thing to do. So that's why, and so long as no other level of government is going to do it, it feels like it's kind of silly not to ask cities to try. So that's a very mealy-mouthed, confusing answer, but the kind of like intellectual in me who's thinking a lot about program design and stuff has conflict with the the kind of reporter, storyteller, chronicler of human stories side of me, which sees something like that happen to this girl and doesn't want it to happen again. So
Thank you. Yeah, it's complex like all of the others. And I know you have to rush, but thank you so much for joining us today. Your book and your comments shed much needed light on this very difficult subject.
thank you for
Thank
having me
you.
so much. And thanks for everyone for the questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but it was really great to be here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Connor. Take
Bye.
care.
Thanks.
Bye. The Outdoor Art Club's next public speaker event, Local Business Heroes, will be held a week from today, April 22nd at 1 o'clock, and will feature 3 local business owners who will each share the innovations they've made over the last year to constantly adapt to the ever-changing business climate posed by the pandemic. You'll recognize their businesses for the very visible part in our community. Susan Griffin Black of EO Products, Brian Canepa of Mill Valley Market, and Peter Schumacher, whose restaurants include Buckeye Roadhouse and Bungalow 44. You can register for this and all future webinars at the Outdoor Art Club website under public events. That's outdoorartclub.org. And just go to public events and ask to be on our mailing list. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.